In 1914, the British Empire went to war. Across Europe and the Middle East, trenches were dug. Soldiers fought for inches of land. At sea, Britain's naval supremacy was being threatened by a silent, deadly killer, the U-boat. A complex system of codes and ciphers kept the enemy a step ahead. Britannia was at risk of no longer ruling the waves. Civilians were recruited to special military service to help win the war by intelligence. They weren't soldiers, but they knew how to map, negotiate, translate, and work with incomplete information. They had traveled widely. They were archaeologists. This is the story of how archaeologists helped change the course of the First World War.
Right at the beginning of the war, the Admiralty was trying to protect Britain's interests and seaways, and it was very quickly realised that the way to do this was understand what the enemy was doing, and that would be by decoding their messages. And that began to see action not only in the North Atlantic, but also in the Mediterranean and what we would now call the Middle East. So first of all, the Navy got its instructors from its naval colleges to come and work there. But the workload became so large that by 1915, the Admiralty started to look to civilians. Instead of saying, we're just going to use naval personnel, we're going to look into broader academia and say, A, who understands German, and B, who understands the way we can understand fragmentary information and make sense of it. You get this very eclectic group of people. You get mathematicians, theologians, classicists, all coming together and trying to make sense of these codes as they were coming in the whole time.
Archaeologists were an unusual breed at that time. A lot of them had spent time in the Middle East, which very few people had done. So they spoke the language. They were used to working in very difficult circumstances. They were used to making connections with the local authorities there, the sheikhs, the people who ran local society, in order to get things done. They, of course, were used as archaeologists with dealing with incomplete information, possibly contradictory information. They were used to interpreting human behaviour from material remains. And all of this, I think, is quite relevant to intelligence work. It was people who were not trained in this kind of activity. They weren't trained intelligence agents. They were adventurers. They were good at putting together something out of nothing and making something work on a shoestring.
Often in an archaeological excavation, you get a few pieces of the jigsaw and you have to fit them together, you have to put it into a wider picture. And that's probably pretty much the same with a lot of intelligence work. You're trying to fit together some of the signs to see what the bigger picture is. And I think archaeologists were valued for that skill they had in processing intelligence, where you didn't really know the full story.
It starts off as a really quite small group, grows enormously in 1917 because the Germans were sinking more and more tons of Allied shipping, and therefore Room 40 needed to recruit more German speakers, and there was a decision to recruit more women from what were called safe backgrounds, and they were daughters of bankers, politicians, because they were thought to be good families and therefore they must be secure in the sense that they wouldn't talk about what they were doing. Winifred Lamb had studied classics at Newnham College. She'd gone up in 1913, so women at that point don't get a degree from Cambridge, they just study. She takes in her final year classical archaeology as one of her themes, so she gets very interested in Greek pottery. She finishes her studies, and in the summer of 1917 she wonders, well, what do I do? And she then gets approached by this sort of the Hampstead set. The person recruiting was Sir George Young. He got his wife to invite Winifred Lamb to lunch and said, I just happen to have this person who'd like to have a chat with you. I think the phrase was, there's an interesting job going. So really here within 6 months of graduating, she's in this very, very responsible job, helping to understand German communications and trying to save British lives. One of the colleagues she had in naval intelligence was Jack Beasley, who was an Oxford classical archaeologist. He just started to publish his series of works on Athenian figure-decorated pottery and attributions. He started to recognise that even if there wasn't a signature, an inscription, that there were stylistic connections between different pieces. And his theory was very much that if you looked at the detail, so for example, the way an ear would be painted, or the way an eyebrow, or the mouth, the unintentional details would be copied in different pots. So therefore, if you could see how a painter decorated the ear, you could identify that painter across a range of pieces. Now, what I think was going on in the First World War as he was recruited for naval intelligence was, again, he was looking for those subconscious details of signallers, the shorthands, the mistakes, the patterns. And those patterns were what helped identify the signaller, and therefore you could start using that to group together signals by the same individual and break the code, as he had done for the Greek pottery. So we see these academic skills from a totally different area being applied to code breaking. Blinker Hall was a mastermind who had a vision of how naval intelligence would work in the First World War. And one of the interesting associations was David Hogarth. Hall and Hogarth got together really in the first few months of the war. The two families knew each other. Now, David Hogarth was an archaeologist and said, let's bring people together to make sense of what's happening in the eastern sphere of operations.
David Hogarth was the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. He knew a lot of former students at Oxford, and really he was the linchpin that made sure that all of these people who were posted to different parts of the Middle East came together, worked together, swapped intelligence, swapped views on how to take things forward. And he, if anything, was an unofficial guiding hand that made sure the best use was made of all these people and their experiences.
Hogarth then moves to Cairo, where he gets involved with the Arab Bureau that was collecting intelligence. If the Ottoman Empire moves against the Allies, it threatens the sort of southern flank. What he did was come up with a really audacious plan through this intelligence gathering of attacking the Ottoman Empire through what we would now call Syria. Hogarth had been excavating in southern Turkey. He'd worked at Carchemish with the British Museum excavation. He'd travelled very widely in the Ottoman Empire. In fact, he'd been the first Oxford student at the British School at Athens, a British archaeological presence in the Mediterranean. It's a permanent research base where you could live for part of the year and then travel and come back to it. There's a library. And that had been operating under a whole series of directors, including Ernest Gardner.
Ernest Gardner studied classics at Cambridge and became interested in classical archaeology. So when the British School at Athens was set up in 1886, he went out to Athens and actually became its first student. And soon after, he became its director and spent about 10 years there. And so when war broke out, even though he was quite a senior university figure by 1914, I think he felt duty-bound to sign up, even though he was in his 50s. By the time he came back, he knew a great deal about Greece. He had travelled around, he knew the language, he knew the landscape. Gardner went to Greece as an intelligence officer. Archaeology was never really the primary reason why he was there. The Salonika Harbour side was a hotbed of espionage. There were a lot of foreign spies there. Greece was a neutral country, and so there was nothing to stop people using the German embassy or the Austrian embassy to spy on what was happening with the British ships in the harbour. So I think the archaeologists who were serving in intelligence were just trying to keep track of people. The other thing that Gardner did is simply read the papers in Athens. So he, again, could read these papers coming out of Athens. Some of them had a very particular political agenda. By reading these royalist newspapers, what Gardner was doing was trying to work out what the mood was, whether the king was actually going to do anything about this invading force in the north of his country, to keep his finger on the pulse.
And this is all collected in Athens and effectively forms an extension of the Arab Bureau. So the British School at Athens and the Arab Bureau come together as part of the intelligence gathering network in the Eastern Mediterranean.
By 1915, it had become quite obvious that the British intelligence system wasn't quite suited to the complexity of Middle Eastern politics. And there were very different factions gathering information in very different places: Cairo, Alexandria, Ismailia, the Sudan, the Red Sea, Basra. That's how emerged the idea of a single entity channeling intelligence, gathering intelligence throughout the regions. The Arab Bureau was finally formed in 1916. The aims of the Bureau were to harmonise British policies in the region and British political activity in the region, but also to produce propaganda amongst the non-Indian Muslims. So it covered a very vast territory, basically all the Arab regions of the Ottoman Empire, so from Egypt to Mesopotamia and including the Arabian Peninsula. For a lot of the military people and military intelligence people, the Arab Bureau was never much more than a random gathering of amateurs, which probably comes from the fact that a lot of archaeologists were involved. Hogarth was the first director, and because of all his qualifications as an archaeologist, he was able to gather a crowd, a very scholarly crowd, that Gertrude Bell would later describe as a brilliant constellation. And most people in this crowd were archaeologists. Hogarth had given Lawrence his first archaeological job in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Because they had very close links, then Lawrence was able to navigate spheres and circles that he wouldn't have access to normally because he wasn't a very high-ranking army officer. It's also thanks to Hogarth and another archaeologist, Leonard Woolley, that Lawrence got a job in the army in the first place, because at the beginning of the war he tried to enlist and he was too small, so his application was rejected. But then in August 1914, Leonard Woolley wrote to the Foreign Office and said that he was offering his services and those of his assistant in Syria, T. Lawrence. So Woolley wrote, "Dear Sir, I fancy that my name has come before you in connection with work in North Syria, and during the last winter I assisted in the survey of South Palestine up to the Egyptian frontier, carried out by Captain Newcomb, Royal Engineers. Should the present trouble extend in the Near East, and the Turkish Empire take sides against us, I think that as I know the language, the people and the country, I might perhaps be of some use to the government. I propose to enlist in the regular army so as to be trained for any such emergency. I do not know whether my enlistment would prevent my being called upon for any special work that might otherwise have been assigned to me. I may add that besides Arabic, I know a fair amount of modern Greek. My assistant in Syria, Mr. T. Lawrence, would also gladly offer his services for any work in that part of the world." So that's quite interesting, because he was basically telling them, please employ me as a spy. The Foreign Office forwarded that letter to the Army Council at the War Office, saying, "These gentlemen are known to this department to possess a very competent knowledge of Turkey and the Turkish language. They behaved with considerable gallantry on the occasion of an attack by Turks and a party of Europeans at Jarablus last spring," so that Carchemish where they were digging. "Sir Edward Grey, who was the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, thinks therefore that the Army Council may be willing to give their favourable consideration to the offer in question," and both of them were incorporated and started doing intelligence work. One of the tasks of the Arab Bureau was to send to London a weekly summary of the state of affairs, and that became the Arab Bulletin. The Arab Bulletin was created on the initiative of T. Lawrence because he wanted a secret magazine of Middle East politics. And he edited the first number in June 1916. He sent a lot of reports from Arabia, and that enabled readers in London to follow the Arab revolt week by week. The bulletin also received a variety of essays and articles by different contributors. And these contributors sometimes wrote at very great length and with scholarly exactness. The Arab Bulletin was very literary. David Hogarth set up the editorial guidelines himself, and he thought that it was as easy to write in decent English as in bad. So he just imposed that sort of literary tinge to the Arab Bulletin, which makes it really nice to read. The Bulletin was quite severely leaked at the very beginning, so after a while it was decided not to put anything too important in it. And then the French and the Italians were also aware of its existence, which sort of defeated the point. There are some good reports actually in the Arab bulletins, including one called Archaeologists as Enemy Agents. So that shows that archaeologists were not used only by the British, they were also used by the German and to some lesser extent by the Turks.
We're looking at the first issue of the Arab Bulletin.
It's dated from the 6th of June 1916 in Cairo at the Savoy. That's where the Arab Bureau was housed. So the format really varies. So sometimes the bulletin just published extracts from different communications that they had received. So you have this extract and then a note by Cairo commenting on it. And then we move on to Arabia with a bit of information and then different telegrams. And then we move on to North Africa. So that shows also the extent and the scope, the geographical scope that the bulletin covered. Bell had enough qualifications herself to pretend to a job in the Arab Bureau, of course. She had travelled very extensively through the region just before the war. She spoke Persian, Arabic, Turkish, German, French, Italian, so she was very gifted. Bell's best friend was called Janet, and she happened to be Hogarth's sister. And finally, she was called by Hogarth in February 1916 because he thought she would be extremely helpful with all the maps and all the map work that had to be done, and also to compile maybe handbooks on various regions and various tribes. So she arrived in Cairo in February 1916 and then started working with the Bureau, and then was very quickly sent away to Basra to advise Percy Cox, who was the chief political officer there, and to liaise between Mesopotamia, which at the time was under the influence or the jurisdiction of the India Office, and the Arab Bureau, who reported to the Foreign Office.
There was a very small group of political officers and what were called special service officers working in Basra. Gertrude Bell and Reginald Campbell-Thompson shared an office to begin with. And Gertrude Bell writes home early on saying that Thompson is very obliging, very amiable, and she seems to get on well with him. But not long after that letter, she writes a private letter to David Hogarth, her great friend in Cairo, which says that Thompson isn't any damned use. I don't think I've met anyone just like him, so amiable and so futile. Reginald Campbell Thompson, was primarily an epigraphist. He looked at inscriptions, particularly cuneiform tablets, was very good at translating those, trying to understand the pictograms, the different symbols, looking for patterns. He does seem to have been brilliant at some things, but very impractical at everyday life. And in fact, Thompson's own boss in Basra, who was also analysing Turkish ciphers, writes home to London in an official report to his superiors in the War Office that describes Thompson as a curious old bird with a most amazing inverted brain. He was clearly someone who was annoying for most of the time, but has these flashes of brilliance. And certainly in the Basra office, he held the record for deciphering a Turkish code with the least amount of information available. And he had a brilliant insight into the most difficult code that was used in the Middle East during the war, a German double transposition cipher, which was about the most difficult cipher that anyone could produce at the time. And that insight that he came up with proved later to be correct.
Before the war, Reginald Campbell Thompson was the first director of David Hogarth's dig at Carchemish on the northern border of modern-day Syria. Leonard Woolley and T.E. Lawrence also worked together on the site, and their partnership was to be cemented when they were volunteered together for an unprecedented survey with an intelligence twist.
The Palestine Exploration Fund had mapped an awful lot of the Palestinian part of the Middle East, but there was an area missing. At the very southern end of what was then Palestine, between Beersheba and the border with Sinai, which was occupied by the British, there had never really been any proper surveys done. It was, of course, becoming obvious that that was going to be the key battleground if Britain was going to go to war with the Ottoman Empire. And so military intelligence desperately wanted some decent maps of that part of the country. The Palestine Exploration Fund had a very good reputation with the Ottoman Empire and had done, of course, a lot of surveys related to biblical archaeology.
The political and military community were interested in what the PEF as an organisation might be able to achieve, which would be helpful to it, and that was good, reliable information about a part of the world in which they were strategically interested. The Ottomans were our allies at that point, and we were interested to know how things lay in their country. The Wilderness of Zin survey is really the only time that the powers that be got very much involved in the PEF and told it what to do on its own behalf, as it were. And the person who told them what to do was Kitchener. And his feeling was that there was an area of Palestine which had not been properly surveyed and that it was necessary to survey. And the letter from the government basically says you may want to appoint some archaeologists to conduct something while this operation is going on. You are going to apply for a firman first of all so that we can conduct some work, and you might want to provide a couple of archaeologists to provide a bit of cover, a cover story. This letter basically lays out the proposal that the PEF obtain the permission of the Ottoman government to the execution of a survey of the area lying between Palestine proper and the Sinai Peninsula, namely the Wilderness of Zin. A party of 5 officers is at the present moment employed in completing the survey of the Sinai Peninsula proper, and they will be able, if permission is granted, to execute a rapid survey of the area beyond this boundary in the time and within the money at their disposal. The proposed survey is very desirable from a military point of view and is essential for the proper study of the problem presented by the defence of the northeastern frontier of Egypt. So there you have the British government basically saying to the PEF, you're going to go and get us permission.
And so this turns into the PEF supplying 2 young surveyors.
That's right. One of our committee members was Frederick Kenyon, who was director at the British Museum, and he said, I know of a couple of likely chaps who are working up with Hogarth at Carchemish in the north of the country, And they're just hanging around in the summer doing nothing. Why don't you get them down and they can do this project for you? And that's where Leonard Woolley and T. Lawrence come into the employ of the PEF. Captain Newcomb, who was the Royal Engineer who was heading up the military operation, writes back that he was expecting a couple of learned and wizened old gentlemen, and he saw these two young kids with knobbly knees in shorts turn up on his doorstep and treated them accordingly. Lawrence was certainly a people person. This is something which came out in Carchemish as well. He was very good at dealing with disputes. He was good at reining Woolley in sometimes, who had quite a temper on him, and that he was very quick at picking up language and dialect. So I think he was probably a very useful team member in that sense. Archaeologically speaking, he didn't know much about the southern Levant, and neither did Woolley. They were digging up in the north. They had no idea what the archaeology of the southern Levant was like, and local experts were incredibly important to help them make sense of what they were seeing a lot of the time. It's really left to Lawrence to work up the manuscript and deliver it to the PEF for publication. And this he does first of all from Whitehall and then from Cairo. It was very, very quick, the whole thing. It was 6 weeks in the field. And we have here a really interesting letter, which is from Leonard Woolley to Hogarth, talking about the manuscript. He says, "I put L's name on the title page, which he hadn't done, but of course it ought to be there." And this is then asterisked by Lawrence himself in red, and he says, Lawrence says, "I much object to this. It isn't in any respect my book, and I would very much rather that my name was not on the title page." Now, we also have a proof copy of the final publication, which is here, which shows only Leonard Woolley's name. At some stage, this situation is reversed, and the final publication is indeed published with Leonard Woolley and T.E. Lawrence on the title page. So it begs the question, why didn't Lawrence want to be named on the final publication? And there are various interpretations. Some people think that maybe he didn't want to be linked because he was already going a bit undercover. Some people think that he was perhaps a bit academically shy, that he was not this blustering, quite kind of brash person that we kind of have in our mind's eye. And the third option is that perhaps he was just a bit embarrassed by the quality of the work, that it wasn't necessarily as good as it could have been because they just didn't have the knowledge. Archaeologically, it was quite a successful survey, given the fact that the people conducting it knew very little about the archaeology of the region, and given that it was such a short period of time to work, they actually did quite a good job. Militarily, I don't think it would have been possible to have the Beersheba campaign without it, because the mapping operation that was conducted alongside the archaeological survey was central to the success of Allenby's push up to Beersheba.
Leonard Woolley was in many ways typical of the kind of generation of archaeologists. He looked for adventure, and so travelling to the Middle East, carrying out excavations, learning the trade, was something that he seems to have taken to very, very quickly. He moved to Port Said on the northern coast of Egypt, where he ran a flotilla of smaller boats that ran agents, so dropped agents on the coast of Ottoman territory, recovered the agents, recovered messages, and generally took part in very important intelligence work. Port Said was, of course, a naval base with Alexandria, the two main naval bases on the northern coast of Egypt. It was at the end of the Suez Canal, and it was the closest location to Ottoman territory just beyond Sinai. It was a busy hub of intelligence work, counterintelligence work, making sure that enemy agents weren't slipping into Egypt in that way, and also a very much a hub for something that preoccupied the British throughout the First World War, which is trying to track German submarines operating in the Eastern Mediterranean. Eventually he takes over a yacht, a motorised yacht, a steam yacht that used to belong to the British Prime Minister, Lord Rosebery, the yacht known as Zaida, and he uses that as his own vessel. But of course it becomes well known to the Ottoman authorities and often has to stay a long way offshore. One day in August 1916, he dropped off agents on the coast somewhere, but then decided to travel further north to the Bay of Alexandretta to look at new locations where it might be possible to drop agents in the future. Whilst offshore, unfortunately, he struck a French mine which exploded. The ship he was on, the Zaida, capsized, and he and the crew were picked up by the Turks, and he spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. At that point, the French, of course, were very annoyed, first of all, that he hadn't consulted them, and secondly, that he had given away the location of their minefield that they'd laid off the bay. And the Royal Navy was extremely annoyed that it turned out that an army officer was running what was, of course, a naval operation using ships.
The head of political intelligence in London, Thompson, then writes a complaint about these academic archaeologists who are interfering in intelligence work. They don't really know what they're doing. And he says they've caught something called submarinitis.
Leonard Woolley tells a wonderful story where both French and British naval captains had seen from sea signals coming from a block of flats. This happened regularly at about 8 o'clock on certain evenings and was reported to Woolley, who then went with another of his officers to observe this, and they saw indeed lights coming from one of the windows in this block of flats. The officer who was with him said, "This is definitely Morse code. I can tell you the letters, but it's not a cipher that I recognise at all." To investigate this further, they found out who owned the flat, and of course it turned out to be owned by a German national. So you have a German national at night clearly signalling out of the window, presumably to a submarine, and so they immediately decide they've got to storm this block of flats to stop it. So they wait until the following night, when at 8 o'clock they expect the messages to be signalled again, and indeed there is the light. And so a small group of them smash the door down, run in with weapons drawn, rush up to the flat concerned. Woolley himself decides to investigate the lights, and so goes through the flat, bashes down a door with his pistol drawn to find a terrified nurse who manages to explain that at 8 o'clock every night she bathes the baby of the person who owned the flat. And Woolley could tell that there was a lamp set up so that she could see what she was doing. This was behind her, facing out to sea, and so as she moved in the room and bent down to bathe the young child, of course she was blocking the light every so often, and so it looked as if Morse code was being signalled out of the window.
For all the pitfalls and personality clashes, archaeologists for the most part flourished in their intelligence roles. Risky overseas work was their norm. But unsurprisingly, years of this work, always on high alert, in the thick of the action, took its toll. This is Reginald Campbell Thompson's War Office file.
In this letter here, where he asks whether he could possibly be demobilised, so we're talking December 1918, and he would very much like to go back to civil life. He then explains that he would like to return as soon as possible to his scientific work, in which he said spent his life previous to the war, and that scientific work is related to ancient languages and archaeology of the Near East.
So we get a sense here of the fact that archaeologists are, after the war, really wanting to take back up archaeology. He's kind of desperate to get back to it and to forget about all of his wartime escapades. There's a nice bit here where he says that he's now more than 42 and he wants to return as soon as possible so that he can get on with his life. I really think it is a nice reflection of the fact that archaeologists, even though they're eager to kind of get into the war, because obviously he's enlisted in January 1915, so the war hasn't been going on for very long. But as soon as it's possible for him to leave, he wants to leave.
All these archaeologists, they really wanted to do their bit for the country, for the empire, for the king, and they all volunteered. But you're right, after the war was over, and they wanted to get on with their life and they wanted to get back to archaeology. There are two exceptions though, and one is Gertrude Bell, who became political officer in Baghdad, and the other one is T. Lawrence, who re-enlisted in the RAF and didn't go back to archaeology.
Britain needed information to win the war. Archaeologists cracked complex codes, tackled difficult terrain, and exploited links with local communities, all in the name of victory. Masters of reportage and self-promotion, they networked effectively in an international theater of war in intelligence. For a couple of years, they seemed unstoppable.
The last 2 years, the 1917-1918 war, is very different in character from the group of amateur friends who were making it up as they went along, this small group of adventurers who set up the structures, without which the war couldn't have been won. The kind of activities they carried out are really the essential core of intelligence activity ever since.